in this lesson, we are going to be learning about light sources, and reflection. Okay. The first thing we want to know about light is that no matter what the light source is, whether it's a light bulb or the sun, that light typically moves in straight lines. Okay. So light moves in straight lines. And a consequence of it moving in straight lines, it radiates out in straight lines, is that it reflects in straight lines as well. So if there was a surface here, very smooth surface, the light would reflect out in straight lines as well, right? No matter what the surface is, actually, the light always reflects out in straight lines based on the planes of that surface. So our first big point, and something we want to think about particularly in regards to the planes, is that light moves in straight lines. Okay, very perfectly straight lines. Okay, in straight lines. This is how we want to think about how light moves. All right. The second thing we want to be aware of is the sources of light around us. So I'm going to draw a simple scene here. And we will have the sky and the ground. And then we can put in a sun here. Let's say this is an outside scene. So in our typical outside scene, when we think about light and you ask somebody, well, how can we see everything? Where does the light come from? People will obviously say, hey, it comes from the sun and it's radiating from the sun. And while that is true and the majority of the light is coming from the sun, on Earth, when we're standing outside, the sky is also acting as a light source. Light waves move through the atmosphere, and the sky and its beautiful blue nature itself becomes a light source as well. And so the sky in itself also casts down its rays of light, right? Its blue light gets cast down into the world. And so we have the rays from the sun and the rays from the sky shining down onto the ground and onto the objects and so on and so forth in straight lines. And so we have two light sources already. But then what happens is everything that is accepting the light on the ground surface and what have you, then itself sends light back up into the atmosphere, right? And of course to the objects around it. And you can see here that we actually typically have three major light sources going on. Now, if you are in a room, your bedroom, for example, and your bedroom light is on, then you're really only having around two light sources. And that's kind of this style of interior lighting, really. You know someone is inside based on the light being a particular way, right? They're kind of lit from one light source, one main light source, the bulb, and then that light bounces all around the room and on all the objects, and then you have the secondary lighting coming there, should I say the reflected lighting from all those objects filling the room. Now, in this instance, we would technically call the sun the key light because it's the brightest and it's the main light source. The sky would be our secondary light source, or you could call it the ambient light source as well. But let's keep it secondary for now. And then the ground would be the reflected light source. Okay, reflected light, which you could also call bounce light, and which itself, depending on the circumstances as well, generally speaking, would also be ambient light, because it's contributing a sort of not as bright light to the scene. So the key light really is the brightest light, and the secondary lighting and the reflected lighting, the ambient lighting, is the other types of lighting. And we'll talk about three-point lighting later on, not too far from now. And three-point lighting is really critical for us when we want to color and paint our characters in a way that is super convincing, super believable. Doing things that you wouldn't think you would do with paint color, basically, to achieve a very believable and a very appealing effect. So our second point over here is that, generally speaking, three light sources are good, right? Three light sources are something we really want to have in our work if we can, and of course based on the style of the work that you're doing. If you are doing more simplistic coloring, you may not even have distinct light sources, right? If you're not going for a super 3D look. However, we want to know the extent of our capabilities when it comes to lighting and how light actually works. All right. Now moving on to reflection and reflectivity. I'm just going to make this stuff a little bit smaller so there's some space. Imagine, if you will, light flying from the sun in straight lines. It's beaming off and it's going to hit two balls, right? We'll have a ball here. Let's call this ball the glass ball, and we'll call this ball the clay ball, right? So it's hitting a glass ball and it's hitting a clay ball. And what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in with a microscope onto the molecular structure of these balls. So here's our zoomed in view. Okay. And when we zoom into the molecular structure of glass, we see that the molecules are really close together and they're really tightly packed next to one another, so that the surface of the glass is kind of really smooth. Okay. And when we come to the clay at this very close zoomed in particle molecular level, we notice that the particles are kind of very very randomly placed, and they're going all over the show. And so the surface of the clay at that level is kind of has all these little mountains and valleys and ditches and things going on. And so what happens is light still continues to move in straight lines. It doesn't change that it moves in straight lines, but when it hits the clay, it hits at all these different angles and then reflects off in really crazy ways, right? And so that light particles and the lines of the light particles, if you will, go in all these different directions and start overlapping each other. And because the reflection is not a direct bounce back, a straight bounce back, you get a sort of a hazy appearance when those types of surfaces, like clay type surfaces, rock type surfaces, matte surfaces, are hit with light. They just do not reflect things very well. Sure, they reflect their color, they reflect their value. They do not reflect highlights very well. They do not reflect the environment around them very much. They also have a different type of bounce lighting, right? Which is very hazy. You can imagine if these were little particle dots bouncing around here in the clay area of things, would just be like a kind of a hazy glow of light, right? However, conversely, when these straight light beams hit glass, for example, as a surface type, it bounces directly back. And because of this direct bounce back, this gives glass its nature of showing off highlights and often reflecting the world around it, the colors around it, the things around it. And this applies to all highly reflective surfaces, glass and metal and chrome and things like that, right? Very shiny plastic, etc., etc. And so knowing this, understanding how light works and interacts with these types of surface types, helps us to understand how we would render or paint or color something that is plastic versus something that is perhaps cotton versus something that is perhaps chromed, right? So it helps us understand, okay, maybe I should have really bright highlights on things that are metal, on things that are very shiny, but on things that are cotton or wool, I wouldn't go too crazy with the highlights, right? And things, of course, go into various degrees of complexity, where you really want to take time to understand why and how does silk reflect light compared to why and how cotton reflects light. And so this gives us our third point here, types of reflectivity, right? Based on the material type. Okay, types of reflectivity. Now, we are going to move to the form lighting principle in the next lesson. The form lighting principle is really the hardcore lighting principle that, all painting, coloring is based off of. But I feel that you should be now well equipped in your understanding of light, planes, and value to really grasp that in a rapid way, and I hope you do. So that is it for this lesson. Lights move in straight lines. Generally, we want to strive for 3 light sources. That's a guideline, not a rule. And the types of reflectivity based on the surface material type. I'll see you in the next lesson.